Today, I want to talk about how to set up your desktop environment for agentic coding or vibe coding or harness engineering, whatever we're calling it these days. And I'm going to use a very obnoxious analogy of classical French cooking techniques to set the scene. The modern professional kitchen is structured around a concept called the kitchen brigade. The kitchen brigade is a hierarchy of rules and responsibilities that make sure that the kitchen is pushing out the food in the way that the chef designed. It's hot, it's tasty, it's orderly. And at the top of the kitchen brigade, we have the chef de cuisine, the head chef. The head chef sets the menu, he gets the vibe of the restaurant, he has those connects for the black market turnips that nobody else can get. He has some people under him, a sous chef, which is kind of like the COO. He's making sure there's not a lot of grab ass happening and the kitchen is running day to day the way that the head chef wants. You have your sauciers, you have your pastry chefs, and all the way down at the bottom, you have somebody called the garçon de cuisine, the kitchen boy. Now, this sounds like a bitch job, but I would say it is maybe one of the more important roles in the kitchen. The kitchen boy that we're looking at here is George. George is a former Goldman Sachs trader who quit his job, moved to Paris to climb the culinary ladder, and live his dream of becoming a gourmand. And the first day, he sits down with the chef de cuisine and he teaches him a very important lesson, which is called mise en place, which means everything in its place. George's role is to set up the kitchen so that it operates effectively when the chefs come in. He's going to be dicing the onions. He's going to be making sure those little squirt bottles are filled with the correct fluids. He's making sure all the knives are sharpened. In addition to this, he's bashing rats' heads in and scraping cocaine off the workstations. But his job is really to make sure that when the chefs come in, they're there to cook. They can execute on the meal, and they're not worrying about the logistics and the prep work that had to come beforehand. They can make sure that that beef bourguignon comes out perfectly, and there's no complaint. So prepping your ingredients in this analogy, I think, is kind of like your prompt. And one of the biggest things that I've been using a lot of is this thing called Aqua Voice. And Aqua Voice is a dictation model. It's a paid API, but it's very good at dealing with utterances and understanding the structure of what you're trying to say, rather than just being a verbatim one-for-one copy of what you said into the mic. So you could use something like a whisper sync or something local, but I find that this model is extremely helpful. I'll give you a demo of what this looks like. So when you come into your input box, wherever you're focused, you hold down a function key and you say, let's make sure that this refactor isn't fucked up. Sorry, I mean messed up. And you'll see that it understood that I wanted to change the sentence in flight. And I find this extremely useful because I think as you're writing so many long prompts, you can be very verbose and think in your head, and you can kind of move through the idea more fluidly rather than spending time in a Google Doc. You can kind of be looking at a situation live, look at logs, look at whatever you need, and give a really good long prompt that something like Claude Code or Codex could use. In addition to Aqua Voice, I think it's really helpful to make sure that your markdown files are clean, your kind of dot files. So making sure that the memory files, the agent.mds, the skills are all pruned and cleaned properly. I find that these things go out of date very quickly. So I'm a big fan of keeping them very light and relying more on just code comments or kind of just very light skills that can do things like figure out how to do the build process. But as we're leaning more and more on CLIs rather than MCP, I think that just kind of putting things in help flags and stuff like that is a lot more helpful than these really dense markdown files, as they can kind of screw up the agent and put them in a wrong direction. In addition to the prompts and the ingredients that he's getting ready, George is also going to set the equipment when he comes in the morning. So our equipment is our editors, our computers, our IDEs. And one thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that these things are tuned for agentic coding. So if I have 4 or 5 work trees open for Bento, I have to have Xcode and cursor open. Sometimes I have cursor closed, but most of the time I have it open. And one thing you're going to want to make sure is that the settings in these IDEs are not indexing everything. They're not doing background processing for agents. You want to make sure that they're as light as possible. And there's a few tips and tricks you can do with Xcode that I'll share later. But thinking about structuring your packages too, so that you have things that are shared between projects like build systems or stuff like that. If you can keep the package light, you're just going to have a much better time and be able to work on more things in parallel. So he's also coming in and he's making sure that those little tickets for the food orders are ready to go. And I think it's a really good analogy because coming from an engineering managing background, I find that working in Linear or Jira, something like that, especially if working alone, is not really helpful. It's things go out of date so quickly. So you want to kind of structure your tickets. I just do them in Apple Notes or just GitHub issues when I'm working with like our QA person. Keep them light. Make sure that they don't go out of date because things move so quickly. I find that spending a lot of time in ticket management is kind of a waste of time. You rather just kind of be able to kind of view what's going on and dictate what the next feature or bug you want to work on. Because you can do things so quickly, you don't need to kind of keep a big backlog. And the last thing he does is, when he comes in and scripts all the cocaine off the tables, he also wants to make sure that the stations are prepped. So everybody has their own ingredients. They have their knives sharpened. And of course, for this, what we would use is Bento. So we would pull up Bento and we'd make sure that we have our workspaces laid out properly. So I have one for marketing, which is kind of like where I draft tweets and do research and come up with ideas, talk to our users. And Xcode is where I do my primary development, where I have Xcode on the side just to build the project and a big ghosty terminal and Codex. And then we have some things like what's down here, backend, which is loads cursor, because I like to use that to actually inspect the code. And then some things like just Zoom and messaging meetings. The big thing is just making sure that your quick switch is set up. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to my Nexus directory. Everything's going to be rearranged. So you'll see that everything moves into its place. And then if I want to come back to a different project, I can go into something like dot files, which is where I work on kind of my system configuration. And this is going to use the backend layout. So having this all set up beforehand is really helpful. Okay, so George has graduated from Kitchen Bitch and now he's becoming a saucier. And there's already 2 sauciers on the line. You've Billy Bayou. He can make a mean Rue Blanc in the back of a minivan. He did some time in Nam, but he is the guy you go to when you want to get something a little more nuanced or something you're a little more unfamiliar with done. So I like it for new feature development because the way that Claude Code kind of shows things in the terminal, I like the way it breaks down the diffs. It's a little slower paced. It's kind of explaining what it's doing. It's really good for figuring out like the direction something's going in. So you have a general idea of the architecture, architectural decisions it's making. And I also like this for debugging really hard stuff. I want to see the path that it's taking. And if I have a hunch or I know that part of the code base really well, I'll probably use Claude Code to go in. It's also really good for UI work. But the other talent that we have on the line here is Heinrich Sisler, and he comes from 11 Madison Park. He's a very serious person, and this is the Codex Pro model. So I use 4.5 now on fast mode and high, and that's the primary model that I use. And I think it's really good for what I call letter rip type work. So you have a pretty good idea of what you want to have built. You have some design system set up, and you can kind of just let it rip. Just give it a basic idea of what it wants to do. I also like this for what I call YOLO optimizations, which is like things that are literally like, please make this system faster or break up this file. It's too long. I trust the model a lot more to make better decisions, and it just kind of seems to go off and do its work really well and just come back. And it's a quiet warrior. Working on this team, there's a few things that he's taught, which is less is more. You don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. So I find that even with Bento or with other tools, I can really only work on 4 or 5 things in parallel. I have my one main big feature that I'm working on that I'm keeping a good eye on. And I usually just work on that on main, where that's kind of like my assembly table. It's where I want to make sure that like the most up-to-date feature that is kind of context dependent on the other branches needs to be worked on. And then from that, I'll branch off and create work trees using Bento. So I can come in here and I can actually create a work tree right in here. And the reason why I do it that way is because I want to make sure that one, I'm branching off main all the time so that it has the most up-to-date code. If I'm sure I'm working on this feature, I'm going to be pushing this in a day, then it's going to be a lot easier to get those pull requests in. And I have my work trees for every other thing besides the main branch that I'm working on. And those work trees I set up through Bento. And I actually don't like the way that Claude Code or Codex does work trees. I think they're really weird. I always want to make sure that I am using main as the branch that I'm building the work tree off of. And I always want to know where my work tree is stored. Claude Code puts it in the directory you created it from if you use dash dash work tree, which I think is insane because it kind of fucks up like the Git history. It screws up things like cursor and other IDEs. And Codex has this kind of like automatic magic thing for like deleting the work trees, which I find annoying. So I think it's just a lot easier to do this through Bento or just running the commands yourself. But the idea is that you want to have kind of like one main thing you're focusing on, some kind of targeted fixes that are pretty well defined. And you can also use work trees or just a new repo to explore some ideas. And as he graduates and keeps moving up the ladder in the kitchen, he is told consistently to make sure to keep your kitchen clean. All the rats are dead, all the tables are clean. But one thing about work trees too is you want to make sure they're in a visible location. So in Bento, you can come in here and you can actually set your work tree location, the folder where they're going to be stored. But if you don't put them there or you don't use Bento, just make sure that they're somewhere that you continually check in on. Put them in your code folder and don't put it in a dot file if you don't want to. It's pretty easy to have these things blow up and they take a lot of system footprint. So if you're using a big Xcode project with a lot of packages, like that could be really huge. And you want to make sure that you're pruning these often. And in addition to just the work trees, you want to make sure that you're refactoring daily. You're not going back and doing this once a week. You want to, every time you open up another file that you want to work on, do a little refactor. See if you can clean it up, break it up, see if you can pull some patterns out, use those as helper functions or modules, because that one keeps the file size smaller, keeps the code cleaner, but also is a good chance to understand what the agents wrote because it's really, really easy for the code base to turn into a black box. And the last tip that he got here is just always delete. Just if there's some old file that you don't know what it does, just get rid of it. And you should have your CI/CD set up so that it can catch failures or build failures or errors. But just remove things that you don't think you need because you're probably never going to use it and you can always rebuild it later. So finally, after 15 years, he's a chef de cuisine. He is now setting up the menu for his own restaurant and he is coming up with the planning for the year. And he has learned some tips along the way. And one is for designing the menu or coming up with the new dishes, you want to be doing a lot of wireframing. And Bento is built in Swift, but we use a lot of magic patterns. And magic patterns is just a little UI tool. It's like V0, but I like it a little bit better. And I'll just draft things up and these buttons don't work and this isn't React and it doesn't really match our design system, but it's a good way to kind of just get like a gist of like how you want things laid out. And I'll turn these into just prompts. I'll just say like, hey, put this Pro Tools add-on marketplace as a sidebar item in the navigation, and then make sure that you have a icon for Pro Tools, blah, blah, blah. And this way it can kind of blend into the UI a little bit better. I used to download these things and use them as references for context, but it would just slow it down, kind of paint itself into corners. So it's really good to kind of just like mock things up in a tool like this. I also use Cursor a lot to build kind of quick UIs as an example. I'll use one of the faster models there. And this is really good to just kind of like get a quick and dirty like wireframe and figure out some stuff. I also have some mocking libraries that do actions that tie into the Bento CLI. So you can kind of actually trigger restorations or do things like this, but it's really good for kind of figuring out what the layout's going to look like. And then last but not least is I'm a big fan of just drawing things on paper, just kind of thinking how things are going to be structured. It's a good idea to just get like the layout so it sits in your head so you can explain it in the a lot later. Then for kitchen techniques or just kind of general architecture of the way things are run, I would say that earlier on, I was pretty hawkish about defining the patterns of how the code base would be set up. Now with the newer models, I think they make pretty good architectural decisions. And you don't want to be too much of a zealot. If you're like a OOP guy or a functionalist Nazi, you want to make sure that you're not giving too many instructions into like only do it this way, because I think that it paints yourselves into a corner and it can kind of slow down the development. But bring more focus to patterns on things like feedback loops or telemetry or error code handling or error handling, and spend a lot of time on setting up the deployment infrastructure yourself. So for Bento, we don't use Fastlane or anything like that. We have a bunch of custom scripts that go through our GitHub Actions to build the release candidates and the releases. And I find it's better time to be more explicit about the build chain and less explicit about like the general architectural patterns that are inside the code base. And remember that you're a chef, you're not some paper pusher. So focus on shipping code more. If you're spending too much time tweaking your skills files or agent.mds or things like that, I think it's a bad sign. You want to keep these things pretty light. These patterns keep changing every few months. I try to keep my agents.md as slim as possible and just let the newest features like the memory agents and things like that that are in Codex and Claude Code to kind of take over that type of stuff. But just make sure to kind of take a look at those from time to time, make sure that they're up to date and cleaned out. And then for planning the next season's menu or the next features you're going to be working around, I would say just fuck around a lot more. Try something in a different language. Try something crazy. Try a different deployment pattern. But do these in fresh repos. Make sure that they don't get a lot of context like contamination, and figure out if you can kind of solve some of your problems without any of the context of the current work repo that you're working in. And just always throw away the old work trees and dead code. There's some feature that's been sitting around in a pull request or in some branch for like a week. Just get rid of it. You couldn't remember why it was important or why you had some super sweet fix for something in there, and it probably means that it wasn't a good thing to get in anyway. And then getting down to actually like cooking, getting the code out the door. My biggest mantra I've always said is just let her rip. It's better to just be pushing code frequently and not worrying so much about like the architectural decisions or the cleanliness of the code or if the feature is perfect. Just keep pushing and making sure that your CI/CD is set up and it's the first and last line of defense is really important. At Bento, we don't use a lot of test harnesses. We have some things for some key infrastructure. We have some integration tests, but we don't really rely on a lot of tests to catch regressions. We use an actual QA engineer, and we send him tickets to kind of go through and click everything and make sure everything works. But we find that it's just harder to maintain the test infrastructure than it is to just catch bugs live. And that's where you're really going to get stuff. So just making sure that you're really tasting everything, you're looking at everything, and that you're really setting up your pipelines for getting code out without having to do a lot of manual intervention. And the last thing is just don't get too into the new cool du jour. It's great to try this stuff out. I always try some of the new open source models from time to time, but don't completely rechange your whole workflow because something you said on the internet. You don't need some clawbot to be giving you feature ideas. I actually hooked that up a week ago and put up like 25 pull requests that I all had to get rid of. And it can be distracting. It can also be draining. So just focus on what's working for you and make sure to keep your MD files light. Make sure that you have a good understanding of what the code is actually doing. It's not just a black box, and you should be good to go. So let me know if you have any questions or any comments about this. I want to do a follow-up video about how I set up Xcode to work with work trees, but let me know. Thanks.